The prophecy of Isaiah. We've now reached part 10 in this series of presentations. We're going to be looking at chapters 13 and 14, and I've entitled this, The World Around. The prophecy of Isaiah. The world around. Reflecting back for a moment on the previous presentations, we saw the weak leadership of the line of kings from the house of David, but we also saw the oppressive empire of Assyria to the north. Neither had worked, and what Isaiah was grasping was the need for and the coming of the reign of a divine king, who would neither be oppressive nor weak. And under that king there would be safety and security. Judah, the southern kingdom of God's people, had been nearly wiped out by the Assyrians and was eventually taken into captivity by the Babylonians, a kind of subgroup of the Assyrian Empire that eventually took the Assyrian Empire over. Assyria as an empire would disappear, and in due time Babylonia would disappear, and the weary exiles or their descendants would then be free to return to the land of Judah. The reason why this had happened? Judah had persisted in rebellion. They decided to run their lives their way, pay lip service to God, and they'd moved themselves outside God's protection. They'd brought the troubles on themselves. But God hadn't let them down. He'd never totally left them, despite all their failures. He was always in control of events, and by His grace, because they did not deserve it, He did restore the people of God into the land of Judah, and their descendants, and from their descendants eventually came the divine King Jesus. Isaiah was grasping some of this. And we finished with verse 6 of chapter 12. Great is the Holy One of Israel among you. Celebrating the centrality, getting God back into the center of life, personal and national life. God who is perfectly ethical, moral, perfect in every way, utterly dependable. God is not some impersonal force. God is involved and wants to be involved in the daily things of life. But we can't manipulate Him just to satisfy our agendas. So often religion has done that over the centuries. We look out in our world today, all parts of the world, desperately seeking for answers. Not because we're clever, not arrogance. We don't have the answers. But the answer lies in getting God back into the center of our lives and living our lives the way He designed us to live our lives. Then there is security and fulfillment. He is indeed the answer. He made us. And the response is, I will trust and not be afraid. And when we get God back in the center, when we take Him seriously, that's the impact of trust. Then we have security, and fear starts to vanish. And the great theologian said that. Liberation, that's freedom. At any level. It's found in God, or it is not found at all. And history shows that is true. If only our societies would appreciate it. The people of God, they were then under threats from the societies all around, the surrounding nations and people groups, the empire of Assyria, Babylonia, it could go on. But Isaiah points out the real threat doesn't come from outside, it comes from within. It comes from within. When we rebel against God, that's the real threat to our security. And the threats around don't have the ultimate control over events. That's where the ultimate control rests. And when we live our lives with God at the center, when we put God into the frame of our thinking, we're allowing His control to give us that security and freedom. Now, chapters 13 to 27 unfold this theme by looking at all the nations round about and seeing where they fit and what will happen to them. In our society today, we are facing, as people of God, threats from all around, in our cultures, in the way things are moving. But the real threat comes from within us. Let us put our house in order, and God is in control, and we come under His protection and control. It'll work through. Now we're going to look at chapters 13 and 14 in this presentation, the start of this section, which looks at the threats round about. Back to our map. Now you can see there the red little patch of land, which was the land of Judah. It's tiny. Now think about us today, the people of God. We are insignificant and small. Declining numbers in the West, although growing rapidly in other parts of the world. There's the huge empire of Assyria, with its capital Nineveh. There's the empire of Babylonia, the two jockeying for power. For quite a while Assyria became top dog and indeed conquered Babylonia, but Babylonia declared its freedom for a while and eventually, in due time, conquered Assyria and took it over. But then there were all the nations, much smaller nations, that surrounded the land of Judah, continually harrying them, threatening them. And the temptation was to try and negotiate and try and get together with them. And then there was the empire of Egypt, now a declining force, but still big and powerful. And interestingly, one very small group that Isaiah identifies around the city of Tyre. Now that was the trading commercial capital and centre at the eastern end of the Mediterranean, and it grew immensely wealthy simply because of its position and its trading power. It was also a threat. Now Isaiah looks at these nations as individuals or as groups, and to see where they fit and what the purpose of God is for them. But the one thing that characterizes all these nations was they had developed pride. And we'll look at aspects of that pride because it's the common factor that runs right across this whole section. Now, just analysing it very quickly, we're going to look at Babylon, which was the kind of culture and commercial centre down in the southern part of what today is Iraq, characterised by brutal violence. Then it moves on to all the nations, a whole group of small nations round about, and the temptation was to get together with them. They were all small, but together they made a reasonable number. He looks briefly at Judah itself, and how Judah related to these nations, and then moves south to Egypt, with its past greatness and power. It comes back to Babylon. Now the context of this was that Babylon kind of declared independence from Assyria for a period of time and got away with it. Assyria wasn't strong enough to control it. It was always a threat. Then eventually Assyria took it over before eventually Babylon won. And then in the midst of all that, Isaiah comes back and looks at the people of God. They simply couldn't see what was happening, and Isaiah was trying to reveal to them just what was happening in the deep spiritual realms in the nations round about. And finally it comes back to the nation that's very close by, a small city, but very, very wealthy. It was a fortress. Apparently it could never be taken, but it was. And it was a trading centre with immense power. All these groups had pride in something or some things. That's what is the common group. But all these nations had come under the control and power in varying degrees of the empire of Assyria. And Isaiah is focusing attention on each of these groups as part of this wider Assyrian empire. Pride. For many nations it was in military power and success, like Assyria and Babylonia. And as I look at this list, just ponder how many of these are true for nations of the world today. Living in our past power and glories, not facing the reality of where we are today. our pride in our culture and our commercial success. Pride that we have when we look at the relative weakness of others as we see it. Pride in our human skills and capabilities when we think we can. In God's eyes, we're nothing. But there's often pride in our religious superiority. One of the tragedies in our divided Christendom is the way some groups see themselves as superior. We've got it right and all the rest have got it wrong. And there's too much of that in the world today, both within institutional Christianity, but particularly in other religions, probably most markedly in Islam. The dependence on religious performance. Now there's pride. These are aspects of pride that Isaiah identifies, and they're scattered throughout these chapters. But they're all true today. So as we look at this set in history of a long time ago, the people of God hemmed in by threatening forces, and yet the problem lay in themselves if they only would put their house in order. Let's just ponder our societies and our own lives and ask, in what are we proud? I'm going to look at little bits from chapters 13 and 14. A prophecy against Babylon that Isaiah the son of Amos saw probably started a new section, so it goes back and reminds the readers that this was coming from Isaiah. The Lord Almighty is mustering an army for war. They come from faraway lands, from the ends of the heavens, the Lord and the weapons of his wrath to destroy the whole country. Remember, this is against Babylon. Wail, for the day of the Lord is near. It will come like destruction from the Almighty. Because of this, all hands will go limp. Every heart will melt with fear. I will put an end to the arrogance of the haughty and will humble the pride of the ruthless. Assyria was certainly arrogant, and it was proud. With its highly efficient armed forces, conscript army, its team of engineers that was superior to any other empire or nation or army in the world at that time. And it's going to have its hands limp. The word for prophecy there is probably closer to meaning a declaration. This is what Isaiah is saying. This is what's going to happen to the Babylonian Empire. And in the original poem, that is placed in an emphatic position. God is at the center. God is in control. The Babylonian power will be brought down. And when in fact the Medo-Persian Empire grew, Babylon couldn't survive. 539 BC, the Babylon Empire collapsed and disappeared forever. Hearts melted with fear. There's a deep thought in that. Human arrogance eventually produces the seeds of its own destruction. And if you look at the great empires and power blocks of the world historically, you can see that. And you can see it happening today if you look with the eyes of God at the world round about. Human arrogance in leaders, in political systems, in religious systems. Eventually it will cause these things to collapse. You can't stand against God in pride forever. Isaiah goes on, see, I will stir up against them the Medes. Isaiah saw something of the power. He didn't talk about Medes and Persians because the Persian Empire wasn't obvious at that time. Too far away for Isaiah to see, perhaps. But he saw Babylon would fall to the Medes. That's the group of people that were on the edge of Iraq, Iran in today's language. I will stir up against them the Medes who do not care for silver and no delight in gold. Babylon, the jewel of kingdoms, the pride and glory of the Babylonians, will be overthrown by God like Sodom and Gomorrah. She will never be inhabited or lived in through all generations. Her time is at hand, and her days will not be prolonged. History shows the Medo-Persian Empire took over Babylon peacefully and just took over the whole empire and changed it with a massive impact on the people of God. But in due time, a decade or two later, Babylon itself was flattened and destroyed. The empire was founded by Cyrus the Great. It became one of the largest empires in history, and indeed was the kind of competitor in the East to the Greek Empire and then the Roman Empire that followed, based more in the West. It had a centralized administration divided into regions, highly organized, highly systematic. It developed road systems and a postal system. And it had an official language that was used everywhere. And it brought about what we would now call the civil services. And it had a large professional army. Now eventually it was destroyed, overrun by the Greek and then the Roman empires. But it had great power. But it wiped out the Babylonians with all their vicious cruelty and all their violence. Let's look at that empire. It was taken over. Babylon itself was wiped flat, 518 BC. Now there's a deep thought. It's similar to the one I gave a few minutes ago. Cultures, societies, people groups that choose to go their own way, rejecting God, are ripe eventually for what I've called implosion. They blow up in themselves. They no longer can survive. They become kind of internally, utterly corrupted. And they're taken over by other cultures. You can look at the history of the world and you see that repeated again and again and again. It comes back to pride. These cultures think they can do it their way. They thumb their noses at God. It doesn't work that way. Because the stresses and strains within cultures, when everyone's trying to go their own way, it weakens them. And they implode. And they're gone. But the going has terrible effects. And Isaiah pictures it for Babylonia. Wealth and livelihood vanish. There's a brutalization of human beings. Leadership's gone. And the whole thing turns into a social wilderness. And as I look out in the world today, I see signs in our Western cultures of the pride, arrogance and decadence of societies that are thumbing their noses at God, and that's producing stresses within the societies that will eventually bring our cultures down. If we look at Isaiah as a whole, or part of it as a whole, Isaiah is highly logical. Chapters 7 to 12 are focused on the time of King Ahaz. Now, King Ahaz was a weak king. He didn't know what to do. He was scared, and he did not trust God. And he led the nation astray by introducing much idolatry. All sorts of temples and religious sites were set up all over the place with practices that were not good. Some were very, very evil, including temple prostitution and child sacrifice. But when he was scared, he thought he could buy the army commander Tiglath-Pileser of Assyria. He could buy him off with money. He paid vast sums of money. Don't attack us, I'll pay you. But he still lost some territory because Tiglath-Pileser didn't keep his word. Now if you go to after that section, to chapter 36, now we're looking at chapters 13, the bit in between. The focus now is in Hezekiah's son, a much better king. He reversed some of the things his father had done. He removed some of these high places, religious sites. He cut back the idolatry. But when the northern kingdom of Samaria fell, Hezekiah tried the same thing. And he robbed the nation, and he robbed the temple of all of its wealth, trying to buy peace. Babylon was beginning to rise in power then, and there's a record of him receiving a delegation from Babylon, and Isaiah was not pleased at what he had shown him. But the Assyrians almost took Jerusalem. But Hezekiah listened to Isaiah, and he prayed, trusted God, and the city was spared. Now we're looking at the bit between this. A king that's weak and a better king. And now Isaiah in between is looking at what's happened to the nations. And the point he's making is this: don't go the way of Ahaz, go the way of Hezekiah. Learn to trust God. Put your house in order. The nations round about aren't the real problem. You are the problem. Bring God back into the centre of your life. He had failed to trust God, whereas Hezekiah began to learn to trust God. Now, he made many mistakes. So there's a complete cohesive pattern in this part of the book of Isaiah. It illustrates some key principles. Basically, that's what we human beings are a bit like. We think we can run it our own way and that we know what is best. I just have to ponder for a minute. If God made us, God knows the best way for us. And if we run our lives in His way, then that is the best. But by nature we are rebellious. So we put in other gods. We don't build the temples and shrines and things like that, but gods of things like materialism or our human successes. And we depend on human efforts and resources. Now just look at Western culture and society today, and you can see how true that is. That's our arrogance and pride. We're back to the word pride again. We think we can do it our way, we know what's best. But what it leads to in a society, and Isaiah maps this out with vivid clarity, when a society goes that way, when we all try to run it our way, we come into conflict with each other because we don't know what's best. And eventually it leads to corruption, injustice and brutality. That's what is seen in the nations round about, and sadly was seen in the people of God. That's the inevitable consequence. When we don't run our societies the way God planned them to be run, it doesn't work. You see, we think we can take advantage of others, and they won't take advantage back. But when society collapses, it comes back like a boomerang and hits us hard. And if you look at the West at the moment, there are many in powerful positions that are taking advantage of others. And as the rich get richer, the money comes from somewhere. It's coming from the majority who are not the rich, not the ruling class. But eventually society will collapse and it will blow up. It will implode. And it will boomerang back. And those who have accumulated all that arrogance, pride and wealth will find it's all gone. It's almost inevitable. Now you have to look at that picture and ponder it, maybe watch it again and again. Think it through. This is the picture that Isaiah is painting for us, set all these millennia ago, but still exactly true today. Human beings haven't changed, societies haven't changed, our rebellious nature hasn't changed, God's principles haven't changed. And we need to ponder the message that comes through these chapters. Now I want to go a bit more detail in chapter 14. Chapter 13 looks at God's interventions which brought down the empire of Babylon. Babylon thumbed its nose at God, but it could only do it for so long, and eventually it became so corrupted, so selfish, so ingrown, so proud of its own achievements, that it couldn't survive. and the Medes and Persian army just walked straight in. They couldn't resist. And Babylon as an empire, in a decade or two, had vanished out of history, never to be re-established. Now, chapter 14 looks at it in the reverse direction. Chapter 13 looks at it from the perspective of Babylon. Now, chapter 14 looks at it from the perspective of God's people. And that's where chapter 14 starts, before it goes back and looks at some of the detailed implications for Babylon and looks at the picture overall in some detail. There was a huge impact. Let's read all these verses, 1 to 3 of chapter 14, which is looking at it from the perspective of God's people. God's people had gone into exile, as Isaiah had predicted, and they were treated badly. But when the Babylonian Empire fell and the Medo-Persian Empire took over, this is what it looked like from the perspective of God's people. For the Lord will have compassion on Jacob. That's the people of God. Once again he will choose Israel, and he will settle them in their own land. Yes, they came back from exile, their descendants did. Foreigners will join them and unite with the descendants of Jacob. Historically, that was true. Nations will take them and bring them to their own place, and Israel will take possession of the nations and make them male and female servants in the Lord's land. They will make captives of their captors and rule over their oppressors. On the day the Lord gives you relief from your suffering and turmoil and from the harsh labour forced on you, you will take up this taunt against the king of Babylon. Now let's just take these few verses apart. The impact of the fall of Babylon on the exiled people of God and the rabble that still remained back in the land. The impact was just simply enormous. Now you can't tell, but basically it's the same word in the original language, and it carries the idea of rescue and security. And Isaiah is reflecting back to the rescue of the people from Egypt in the days of Moses. This is what happened. Now the passage is often misunderstood as if it's suggesting that Israel will come top dog and brutalize other nations. That's not what this is saying. It's poetry. It's not literalism. It's brilliant poetry. What Isaiah is picturing here is a reversal. God's people for a long time had become dependent on the nations around. And remember, this section's about the nations around. They would no longer be dependent on the nations. They were allowed to return to their own land, set up their own cities, re-establish their agriculture, build their temple, and become at least a semi-independent nation. And the nations around started to become dependent on God's people. That's the point Isaiah is making. And if you look at it into the future in the days of Jesus, you could see the beginnings of an impact of the pure religious faith of the Jewish people, a minority of them admittedly. And they'd scattered all over the nation round about and were making an impact. And all the religious systems of the nation round, they've just vanished in history. But the God of the people of Judah, the God of the people of God, he went on. And numbers kept growing, people adding themselves to it. In the days of Jesus and the days of Paul in the early church, they were called God-fearers. People who came from a non-Jewish background but attached themselves to synagogues because they saw something better in the people of God. And Paul had a great work amongst them in his travels because many of them found Jesus and found their true liberty in him. There was a huge impact on the people of God when the evil empire of Babylon finally collapsed. Isaiah saw this was going to happen. Now at the end, on the day the Lord gives you relief from your suffering and turmoil, from the harsh labour forced on you, you will take up this taunt against the king of Babylon. And there follows one of the most beautiful poems that Isaiah has put together, because it looks at the fall of Babylon and the way this evil power was reduced and removed, and the liberty that came to the world around. And we'll look at that next. It's in several sections. A tyrant fell. The Babylon Empire went. Even tyrants are mortal and must die. Tyrants often claim almost divine power. You can see that in the world today. But we all end up going to the grave. Overbearing pride. It corrupted the whole empire of Babylonia, and it collapsed. And at the very end, Isaiah brings out the deep spiritual principles that underpin the whole section. I'm going to go through this fairly rapidly. You may want to take time and read this and ponder it again afterwards. How the oppressor has come to an end, that's Babylon. How his fury has ended. The Lord has broken the rod of the wicked, the sceptre of the rulers, which in anger struck down peoples with unceasing blows, and in fury subdued nations with relentless aggression. All the lands are at peace, at rest and peace. They break into singing. Even the junipers and the cedars of Lebanon gloat over you and say, now that you've been laid low, no one comes to cut us down. There had been a succession of tyrannical rulers. They insisted on their own way, wiping out opposition at a whim. Violence and brutality. It created terror in all the nations round about. They just gave in. The people of God, we saw it in the first picture, they're tiny, a minority, and we are a minority today. But God broke through. And even the greatest tyrants, their power will be broken. And peace and security will break out, and it's simply wonderful. Going on, the realm of the dead below is all astir to meet you at your coming. This is a picture of the unseen world of the dead, and the whole Babylonian leadership is going there, wiped out. It rouses the spirits of the departed to greet you, all those who were leaders in the world. Makes them rise from their thrones, all those who were kings over the nations. They will all respond, and they will say to you, you also have become weak as we are. You become like us. All your pomp has been brought down to the grave, along with the noise of your harps. Maggots are spread out beneath you, and worms cover you. Tyrannical leaders die. And this poetic imagery, all humans end up in death, bodies rotting away. Yes, the tyrants may orchestrate a wonderful funeral, but in the end death brings equality, because their power just vanishes totally. They don't take it with them. This is the picture that Isaiah has. Or as the theologian said, human pride is but pretty trappings on a corpse. It's worth pondering. You and I think we've achieved things. Sometimes we think we're important. But if you get into positions of power in a society or a community or in the world, the danger is that human rebellion generates human pride, and it just keeps growing. But we don't take our achievements beyond the grave. The third section, how you have fallen from heaven, morning star, son of the dawn. You've been cast down to the earth, you who once laid low the nations. You said in your heart, I will ascend to the heavens, I will raise my throne above the stars of God. I will sit enthroned in the mount of assembly on the utmost heights of Mount Zaphon. I will ascend above the tops of the clouds, I will make myself like the Most High. But you are brought down to the realm of the dead, to the depths of the pit. Sadly, this passage has been ripped out of context and misinterpreted. And when we come to the last few verses of this chapter, we'll see it is misinterpreted by many today. It's nothing to do with Satan or his angels. Nothing at all. Isaiah is addressing the fall of Babylon. He's addressing the whole problem of human pride. The morning star is Venus. It appears low in the sky just before dawn, but as soon as the sun is up, it disappears. Son of the dawn, that's what it means. And the star disappears. In the same way, Babylon seems so bright, but in the brightness of God, it vanishes. The rulers of Babylon grew in pride and wealth, power, military prowess. They started to see themselves as gods. And human pride feeds in itself. And we start to believe ourselves that we're important and we're good. That's what happened in Babylon. It still is happening today. But death mocks every claim to be God. And that's why it talks of the realm of the dead, which was the picture they had of beyond death at that time. That's how it happened to Babylon. Those who see you stare at you, they ponder your fate. Is this the man who shook the earth and made kingdoms tremble, the man who made the world a wilderness, who overthrew its cities, who would not let his captives go home? All the kings of the nations lie in state, each in his own tomb, but you are cast out of your tomb. Like a rejected branch, you are covered with the slain, with those pierced by the sword, those who descend to the stones of the pit. Like a corpse trampled underfoot, you will not join them in burial, for you have destroyed your land and killed your people. Let the offspring of the wicked never be mentioned again. Prepare a place to slaughter his children for the sins of their ancestors. They are not to rise to inherit the land and cover the earth with their cities. Babylon and its rulers thought they were so powerful and so wonderful. They planned their own funerals, their own reputations. And like many leaders today, they wanted to leave an inheritance of a reputation. How foolish. That's what history shows. And tyrants dispossess and trample ordinary people. And it is still happening today. But in the end, when they're toppled, or when death takes them, very often they're just rejected by their own people. And sometimes their own people try to wipe out their memory out of history. They remove the monuments. They bring down the statues. They destroy the documentation. You see, that's the basic problem. Leadership then and leadership today fails to recognize that leadership is an awesome responsibility, and indeed it's a sacred trust from God. And we either do it God's way or we leave nothing of value behind. Great principles for us today. I will rise up against them, declares the Lord Almighty. I will wipe out Babylon's name and survivors, her offspring and descendants, declares the Lord. I will turn her into a place for owls, into swampland. I will sweep her with the broom of destruction, declares the Lord Almighty. The Lord Almighty has sworn, surely as I have planned, so it will be, and as I have purposed, so it will happen. I will crush the Assyrians in my land. On my mountains I will trample him down. His yoke will be taken from my people, and his burden removed from their shoulders. This is the plan determined for the whole world. This is the hand stretched out over all nations. For the Lord Almighty has purposed, and who can thwart him? His hand is stretched out, and who can turn it back? And it's that last bit that shows the broad principles that Isaiah is addressing and confirms that this earlier part has nothing to do with Satan. Babylon, which had taken over Assyria, unbridled human power, brutality, forcing its way with sheer violence against people all around, including the people of God. Assyria is a kind of representative of that way of thinking. It was violent, it was brutal, it swamped other nations, overweening power and pride. But Isaiah sees behind Assyria, behind Babylon, there's a divine principle that always applies. That when we get into power, when we set up power blocks and leadership that ignores God's purposes, which abuses other people, which becomes proud in its strength and its resources and its weapons and its commercial strength, unbridled human power that stands against God, God's people suffer. But in the end, it all collapses. Every culture implodes, destroys itself from within, utterly corrupted. Because when we try to do things our way, the our ways start to conflict. And a society can't stand that inner conflict within itself. Great principles here for us today. Fundamental principles. That's God's purpose, and it's still true today. God wants the best for all human beings, and He seeks to reach human beings, working through people who've responded to Him. Today it's the people of God, the followers of Jesus. Then it was the people of Judah. They had failed miserably. They had rebelled, and they'd failed to reach out. And because they'd rebelled against God, they'd moved themselves away from God's protection, and they'd lost their freedom. But God still cared for His people. Even though they'd failed, He still cared. And God was still in control of the events. Now the people of Judah at that time, Isaiah's time, started to doubt that God was in control of the events. They felt they'd lost control of everything. It doesn't matter how powerful Assyria or Babylon or any empire in the world today might be, when it thumbs its nose at God, ignores God's ways, then sooner or later it self-corrupts and implodes. Human pride will always be brought down. Brings itself down. It's a divine principle. When we place ourselves and make ourselves like gods and think we know all the answers, we build in structures, ways of thinking that will not survive. But God will go on to bless humanity. You see, there's a logic to this. And the brilliance of Isaiah's insights, his God-given insights, Isaiah saw it. He grasped it. And he saw in the events and the behavior of his own people, the people of God, and their failure. He saw in the events of the power of Assyria, but he realized that in fact it was Babylon that was going to be the greater power, but Babylon would not survive. Isaiah saw the deep spiritual principles. And these are principles we need to ponder today. I want to come back to the last two verses of the section. This is the plan determined for the whole world. Isaiah is laying out a principle. He's merely illustrated it with Babylon and Assyria. This is the hand stretched out over all the nations. It applies everywhere. For the Lord Almighty has purposed, and who can thwart Him? His hand is stretched out, and who can turn it back? When we set up empires and power blocks and nations and communities, and we allow people to become in power in that, it'll generate pride and a rebellion. And when we want to do it our way and we think we know the best way, sooner or later it conflicts with those around about. And within such a society, everyone trying to do it their way, it will implode. And sadly, I see that in Western culture today. We've pushed God to the margins. We pay lip service to the fact that God exists. We've squeezed him out of public life and out of the decision taking. And the inevitable result is that our societies, in due time, will be ripe to tear themselves apart and will be taken over. And it may prove very uncomfortable. You see, you and I are free to choose to work in line with God's plans. The principles are there. Isaiah saw it. God does not force us. But when we choose to work in line with God's ways of doing things, then we have that inner security and purpose. But if we choose not to do it that way, well, it just simply doesn't work. It didn't work for Assyria, Babylon, the nations round about, and it won't work for the empires and power blocks of today's world. There are deep lessons for us today. Next presentation, we're going to look at what I've called a dangerous collaboration.